Good morning, my lovelies, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Isa, and I am a disabled scholar, advocate, and writer. I'm currently in grad school, and I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user. So, as you can see from the title, today's question is, as an ambulatory wheelchair user, am I still considered invisibly disabled? When I was 11 years old, my family went to Disney World for the first time outside of my Make-A-Wish trip when I was 4. And during that time, I was using a scooter that was given to me by the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And on our last day of vacation, 2 different cast members came up to me while I was by myself because there was an issue with our tickets. And I was by myself babysitting my youngest sibling. And both of them demanded proof that I could use my scooter, that I owned it. They got mad at me saying that I was stealing some old person's scooter and that I was being irresponsible, and just a lot of really awful things that when you're already 11 years old and having to use a scooter, it doesn't help with your brain. And they both got very mad at me. And luckily the first time my grandmother was able to step in, but the second time I was 100% by myself in that situation. And I clearly remember afterwards just crying to my mom saying, I don't want to use a scooter anymore. I don't want to use a scooter anymore. I didn't want to use a scooter in the first place going on this trip. But I needed to because I have an energy-based disability. And I remember telling my mom, if I have to use a mobility aid, if I have to use something like this, I want a wheelchair, because people don't question people in wheelchairs. And that's such a memory that is zapped in my brain, especially given that wasn't the only time an adult had come up to me and yelled at me for stealing someone's scooter. Wasn't the only time that I got in trouble for acting like a child while using a mobility aid. That it was a really big deal for me to want some type of wheelchair because nobody questions people in wheelchairs. And this leads me to a very interesting conundrum now, because I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user who uses a wheelchair. I use a wheelchair that is custom to my body, and yet I still feel like I have an invisible disability. My feelings make sense when you consider that my life has been shaped by how people couldn't see my disability, that the constant need to defend that I am disabled, use large terms. We'll get into some of the research that explains some of that behavior. All of those things were the things that I grew up with. I didn't start using a wheelchair beyond, theme parks and long days until 2017, even though I'd been using mobility aids on and off my entire life. However, when talking with people who are invisibly disabled, who do function in a way that their disability is not on display at all, through mobility aids or otherwise, that if I use that term, it feels wrong because it doesn't match their experiences. And my main issue here is thinking about how is this, a child who's using a scooter, any different than these kids who are using wheelchairs, when it's the same disability, it's the same family. There's little me. This is my siblings are so cute. And how does that any different, because the body, the disability, the mobility needs are the same, it's just the mobility aids that are different. Social psychologist Blockmans explored disability disclosure in university settings in 2015. But what they did that was super interesting is that they defined visible versus invisible as a spectrum, providing their participants an opportunity to identify as an alternating visibility. So for me, as an ambulatory wheelchair user, I may have a visible disability that people trust as long as I stay in the wheelchair, don't move my legs, follow these kind of rules of being a wheelchair user that people associate that are really just incorrect ideas of being paralyzed, that I'm considered visibly disabled, or I may feel visibly disabled because that is on display. But once I step out of my wheelchair, once I move my legs, then the doubt sets in and suddenly my disability is no longer. What Blockman's discovered was that individuals who have invisible disabilities or alternating visibility with their disabilities tend to play more into their disability, so play into the stereotypes and the ideas, essentially act as if every day is their worst day, so that when they do need accommodations, when they do need help, that someone isn't doubting them because, hey, you were able to do this yesterday, which ultimately plays into these stereotypes and narratives that trap disabled people. So it's just a cycle. But why are these terms important in the first place? Well, they're important for two reasons. First off, they help us have discussions about privilege. And second of all, they're really big elements of a lot of disabled individuals, particularly invisibly disabled individuals' identity. By identifying as a person who has an invisible disability, you are able to connect with the community and create pride in places where your identity is highly stigmatized. Even as a child, I understood some of the privilege that comes with being a visibly disabled individual with its association to being a wheelchair user, because I knew I was less likely to be questioned. I could just disclose that I'm a wheelchair user without having to disclose my specific health conditions. I was better able to access things because people just accepted me based off of the way that I appeared. As long as I stayed in the chair and I followed these standard protocols for not moving my legs or acting like I could actually, walk. As long as I rejected this ambulatory element of my life. Even now, I highly depend on my wheelchair to disclose my disability to others. I'll allow that to be the initial disclosure. I show up and this is who I am as a disabled individual. When I put my pictures up for profiles on Uber, Lyft, even my school profile with my email, I always make sure to include something that shows my wheelchair so that I have disclosed that this is part of my life to the people I meet, and I never have to have that awkward situation where I need to use accommodations later. However, there's still restrictions in that privilege that I, as someone who uses a wheelchair, I struggle with being able to break beyond the wheelchair disclosure. Yes, I'm a wheelchair user, but the reasons I use a wheelchair are very different from reasons another person might use a wheelchair, which means that my needs and accommodations can be different from that person. It also makes it more difficult for me to disclose my specific experience with my disability, which goes way beyond being a wheelchair user. As someone with chronic pain and a life-threatening condition, the people in my life who have my disability from my community, it's difficult to share our stories when everyone just thinks that all I am is a wheelchair user, and if I say anything else, I'm complaining. As someone who uses a wheelchair, when I go out in the world, I'm more likely to be attacked or face the consequences of some, crime like that because I am visibly disabled, but also still less likely than those who are not white or appear as a woman. It's all of those things play into the privilege and the not so privileged elements of being a wheelchair, being visible versus being invisible. And this is where we get to the crux of the problem, because it's not just based off of the disability. It's not just based off of using a wheelchair or not using a wheelchair. It is largely based off of how do those mobility aids appear? How do those things present in the world? My connection to whiteness and my connection to at least having access to insurance, those things give me the privilege of being able to function as somebody who gets the privileges of, being visibly disabled associated with my wheelchair. Because there are plenty of wheelchair users who are using mobility aids, the same mobility aids, but they appear different, they look more run down, or they're using a hospital wheelchair because that's all that they have access to, because that's what they have to buy out of pocket because insurance denied them, or they don't even have insurance. These things change the way that you function in the world, changes the way if you're invisible versus visible. It's not just based off of the physical experience. It's not just based off of the mobility aids you're using. It's connection to race, class, and gender, transphobia, all of these things will alter the way that people perceive you. And that is the problem I have with our discourse around invisible versus visible disabilities, because it's not just the disability, it is how you function in a world will alter the way that you have access to the things that make you passable as a disabled person or passable as an invisibly disabled person. So when I ask the question, am I still an invisibly disabled individual as an ambulatory wheelchair user, the question doesn't create space to address the other privileges that I have in this world that give me access to the things that would make me, considered by some visibly disabled or invisibly disabled by others. So why did I want to make this video? The reason why I wanted to make this video is because I'm tired of trying to talk about disability issues without talking about the issues that lead into that. That ableism is used as a weapon for racism, transphobia, sexism, all of the bad things. Ableism can be used as a weapon for that. Ableism is very intimately connected to eugenics, which stems largely from white supremacy. And if you don't address those things, you're never going to actually create the systemic change that we need in order for visibly, invisibly, physically disabled individuals to be able to function in the world. That we can't pretend that everybody's experience as an invisible or visible disabled individual is a monolithic experience, because there's so many different ways of experiencing just that one identity. And this doesn't mean that you have to stop posting things like, oh, disabilities can look like this and also this. I mean, I love posting those things. I love pointing out that visibly or invisibly disabled individuals exist, and they shouldn't have to constantly explain themselves. And the same for physically or visibly disabled individuals. I love the hashtag ambulatory wheelchair users exist because it brings voice to a specific problem. However, if we're talking about systemic change, if we're talking about what's going to do the most good over the longest amount of time, we have to stop decentralizing white experiences with access to medical care in our discourse about disability studies and in our discourse about disabled experiences, because only then can we actually address the problem. Because as long as we're facing issues like transphobia, racism, white supremacy, those things disable others. Those things create inaccessible spaces because of elitism, because of hatred, for various reasons. Crutches and Spice, who's on TikTok and Twitter, talks about this so beautifully. And I really strongly recommend you to check out her videos, because that needs to be our foundation of disability advocacy and discourse, and stop centralizing experiences that have access and the ability to constantly change out their mobility aids to align themselves with the most privileged position. So those are my thoughts for today. Am I still invisibly disabled as an ambulatory wheelchair user? I think just as certain terms can be used as tools to help explain our experiences, that there are some things about being an ambulatory wheelchair user that are very much in line with the experiences I had as a young person who was very invisibly disabled. But there are also experiences that I have that are more in line with being visible. And there are benefits and problems to both. And ultimately, in order to address the problems in both, we have to address the bigger issues than just what is the proper identity term for me in this moment.